This is part 2 of a lecture on the history of the sexual revolution. Let me just do a quick review of where we were. I wrote this handy chart. So I argue that before 1945 in America, there was a rule that said no sex outside of marriage, and I'm going to guess that most people believed this rule, even though many people broke the rule. If you look at polls back then, that seems to be the case. But between 1945 and 1965, we have this thing called the baby boomers. And when they're born in 45, the world has changed a great deal and is about to change. So if you're 45, when you're 15, it'll be 60. And when you're 20, it'll be 65. And this sexual revolution happens sometime in the 60s and the 70s. And I'm going to give you more on that. But I argue then that people who were born who were coming of age before 45, so if you're born after 45 and to 65, and that's pretty close to being a baby boomer, you're confused about the rules, because your parents had clear rules, but the society changed by the time you became an adult, right? During the 60s and 70s, you were very confused about rules, and so your children, so this is the children of baby boomers. I'm going to say, if you were born between 65 and let's say 95, just to let those baby boomers go to college and get older before they have children, you had no rules, because your parents, your grandparents had clear rules, and your parents rebelled against those rules, or were confused about what the rules were, and so when you came along, there were no more traditional rules. It was a huge schism in sort of the moral fabric of our society. Things changed greatly. And then by the time you get to the grandchildren, I think if you were born probably, let's say after 2000, certainly if you were born, I would say if you were born after 2000, you're probably the grandchild of a baby boomer. Now, let's talk about the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution happens in the 1960s, but of course, as you know from history, it didn't just come out of nowhere. I place the beginning of the sexual revolution in 1791. And you'll say, Mr. Horn, that seems like an odd and particular date, and the answer is yes. That is the year that the Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, probably the best autobiography in American history, you could argue, is published. And in his autobiography, Benjamin Franklin says that he came up with 13 rules, 13 virtues that he, and it was wonderful. He had like a little spreadsheet, and he would check what rules he had done that day, or which virtue he had been good at. And I want you to listen to his 12th virtue, and I'll let you read it while I read it. Chastity, number 12, chastity. Rarely use venery, and let's make sure we know what venery is. Venery is the practice or pursuit of sexual pleasure, indulgence of sexual desire. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. So I love this definition, or this virtue. First thing, notice there's nothing about marriage here. He says, don't use venery, except for health. How often do you think you should use venery for health if you're a vigorous man with a strong libido, I don't know. Or a woman. Again, I don't think Benjamin Franklin. He does say though, don't use it to dullness or weakness. And then I think this is wonderful. Listen, let's don't say rarely use venery. Let's change this and say don't use venery to the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. That's not a bad rule. So this is in 1791. Benjamin Franklin is not a Christian, as Thomas Jefferson is not either. This is the beginning of the Enlightenment. By the 1800s, though we are in Victorian times, the late 1800s, the late 19th century is when Darwin and Marx, and at the end Freud and Nietzsche come in. And by the time we reach the 20th century, especially after World War I think World War I did some psychic damage to us. The 1920s come, and that's when Freud sort of enters America. You see a shift, and not, I don't think, in the people so much as in the intelligentsia and the smart folk, in the H.L. Menckens of the world, the writers, the newspapermen. And I think you might have seen a sexual revolution appear earlier in the 30s and 40s had it not been for the Great Depression on the one hand and World War II on the other. But by 1945, we then see this a time of great prosperity. We also see the pill, we see the car, the invention of the teenager, all these things. I'm going to argue that the biggest thing for the sexual revolution, though, is the detaching of religion from society, and I argue that that begins in 1791. By the end of the 19th century, we see it happening, and we see it coming into the colleges and universities. In fact, it's the fundamentalists are a man who writes, a professor who writes sort of a critique of modern, and this is modern in the 1920s, 1915s to 1920s, and he writes the fundamentals, sort of attacking the modern thought of diminishing the importance of the Bible and religion. And so we see it already in the 20s. It begins to flower in the 40s and the 50s, and by the 60s we have this huge revolution. So the question, though, is, well, what does this do to our rules? And the idea that you have such a dramatic change in how you view sex has got to do something to folk. And I'm going to say it unmoored us in the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s. It unmoored us. I think the Me Too movement is an attempt to get some kind of understanding of what the rules are in sex. We're not there. And then, by the way, evangelicals and Mormons still have certain beliefs about sex, as do Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses, but oftentimes they don't follow the rules. But it does put us in a strange state, and we'll pick that up and try to figure out what should the rules be, or should there be rules, or what's the story about sex. So we'll pick that up now that we've done sort of our preliminaries.